The sound of hoofbeats across the Asian steppe would change the Roman Empire forever. Somewhere around the year 370, terrified Gothic refugees appeared at Rome's borders with stories of an enemy unlike any the classical world had known. They spoke of mounted warriors who lived on horseback, who drank blood mixed with milk, who scarred their own faces to never grow beards. The Romans dismissed these accounts as barbarian superstition. They were catastrophically wrong. If you enjoy stories like this, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next sleep story. The Huns emerged from the vast emptiness of Central Asia when Rome still considered itself eternal and China ruled behind its Great Wall. Their arrival shattered both empires' assumptions about warfare, civilization, and power itself. Within decades, they would force Rome to pay tribute, demolish Chinese armies, and create the largest steppe empire the ancient world had ever seen. Yet for all their impact, we still don't know for certain where they came from or what language they spoke. The mystery begins with geography. The Eurasian steppe stretches 6,000 miles from Hungary to Manchuria, an ocean of grass that enabled movement on a scale Mediterranean civilizations could barely comprehend. While Romans built roads and Chinese engineers constructed canals, the steppe peoples needed neither. A mounted archer could cover 80 miles in a day. An army could relocate entire populations across distances that would take Roman legions months to traverse. This mobility shaped everything about Hun society, from their political structures to their military tactics to the terror they inspired in settled peoples who couldn't imagine life without walls. But mobility came with costs the sedentary world rarely understood. The steppe provides no timber for building, no stone for fortifications, no reliable water sources. Survival required constant movement between summer and winter pastures, intimate knowledge of weather patterns, and social structures that could function without cities or permanent settlements. The Huns mastered this environment so completely that they could campaign year-round, while their enemies huddled behind fortifications waiting for spring. The archaeological record offers frustrating glimpses of Hun origins. Burial sites across Kazakhstan and Mongolia reveal mounted warrior cultures dating back centuries before the Huns exploded into European awareness. These graves contain composite bows, bronze cauldrons, and evidence of artificial cranial deformation, practices later associated with the Huns themselves. Yet connecting these earlier peoples to the specific confederation that terrorized Rome requires leaps of inference that make historians uncomfortable. Chinese sources provide our earliest written references, though interpreting them demands caution. The Xiongnu Empire that dominated Mongolia from the 3rd century BC until the 1st century AD shares striking similarities with the later Huns. Both relied on mounted archery, both organized around charismatic leadership rather than bureaucratic administration, both alternated between raiding and demanding tribute from settled civilizations. The linguistic connection between Xiongnu and Hun remains debated, but the cultural parallels suggest at minimum a shared steppe tradition. What's certain is that something catastrophic happened in Central Asia during the 4th century. Climate data indicates a period of severe drought and cooling that would have decimated the grasslands supporting pastoral economies. Faced with starvation, steppe confederations had two options: collapse into small survival groups, or consolidate into larger formations capable of conquering new territories. The Huns chose conquest. Their first victims were other nomadic peoples. The Alans, a powerful Iranian steppe confederation, fell to Hun attacks around 370. The Goths, who had settled north of the Black Sea, found themselves caught between Hun pressure from the east and Roman borders to the south. Gothic King Ermanaric reportedly committed suicide rather than face defeat. His people scattered, some submitting to Hun overlordship, others begging Rome for refuge. This refugee crisis exposed fatal weaknesses in Roman frontier policy. For centuries, Rome had managed barbarian peoples through a combination of military deterrence, diplomatic manipulation, and selective incorporation of warriors into Roman service. The system assumed that barbarian groups remained relatively small and disorganized, that Roman military superiority was unquestionable, and that the frontier represented a stable boundary between civilization and chaos. The Huns shattered all three assumptions simultaneously. Gothic refugees presented Emperor Valens with an impossible choice: refuse them entry and face potential alliance between desperate Goths and victorious Huns. Accept them and risk internal instability from settling armed barbarian groups within imperial territory. Valens chose admission, but Roman officials so thoroughly bungled the settlement process through corruption and incompetence that the Goths revolted within months. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 killed Valens and destroyed the field army of the Eastern Roman Empire. This catastrophe stemmed not from Hun military action, but from the cascading political failures Hun expansion triggered. The Goths who killed Valens were themselves fleeing Hun pressure. The Roman defeat demonstrated that barbarian peoples, when sufficiently desperate or well organized, could challenge imperial armies in open battle. This realization would haunt Roman strategic thinking for the next century. Yet the Huns themselves remained shadowy figures during this period. They didn't storm Roman cities or demand formal recognition. Instead, they consolidated control over the Pontic steppe, absorbing defeated peoples into their confederation and establishing the economic foundations for sustained expansion. This consolidation phase reveals sophisticated political intelligence. Rather than exhausting themselves against Roman fortifications, the Huns built the demographic and economic base necessary for future operations. Understanding Hun political organization requires abandoning Roman assumptions about how states function. The Huns had no capital city, no written law codes, no bureaucratic apparatus. Power flowed from personal relationships between the supreme leader and subordinate chiefs who commanded their own followings. This system looks anarchic to modern eyes, but it possessed remarkable flexibility and resilience. A successful Hun leader needed military prowess, but victory in battle represented only the beginning of political achievement. He had to distribute plunder equitably among followers, arrange advantageous marriages, mediate disputes between subordinate groups, and maintain the supernatural charisma that legitimized his authority. Failure in any dimension could trigger rapid collapse as followers transferred loyalty to more successful rivals. This political structure explains both Hun military effectiveness and their eventual fragmentation. The same flexibility that allowed rapid mobilization and strategic adaptation also meant that unified action depended entirely on the leader's personal authority. No institutions existed to outlast individual rulers or resolve succession disputes. The confederation could achieve extraordinary feats under capable leadership, but risked disintegration the moment that leadership faltered. The economic foundations of Hun power combined pastoral production with systematic extraction from conquered peoples. Herds provided meat, milk, leather, and mobile wealth that could be quickly converted to military resources. But herding alone couldn't sustain the Confederation's growing population or satisfy the political need to reward followers with luxury goods. This required either trade with settled civilizations or forcible extraction through raiding and tribute. Archaeological evidence shows that Hun camps contained goods from across Eurasia: Chinese silks, Roman glassware, Persian metalwork, and Germanic jewelry all appear in burial sites. Some items arrived through trade, but many came as tribute payments or war plunder. This accumulation of luxury goods served political rather than purely economic purposes. A leader who could distribute exotic treasures demonstrated his power and generosity, reinforcing the personal bonds that held the Confederation together. The composite bow epitomized Hun military technology and tactical doctrine. This weapon, constructed from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, could shoot arrows with enough force to penetrate armor at ranges exceeding 100 yards. Building one required specialized knowledge and months of work. Mastering it demanded childhood training that began as soon as boys could sit a horse. But technology alone doesn't explain Hun battlefield dominance. Their tactical system integrated the composite bow with extraordinary horsemanship and coordinated maneuvers that bewildered opponents accustomed to set-piece infantry battles. Hun armies could concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points, then disperse before enemies could respond. They excelled at feigned retreats that lured pursuing forces into ambushes. They avoided frontal assaults on prepared positions, instead using mobility to force enemies into unfavorable engagements. This tactical approach required social organization that treated military training as continuous cultural practice rather than specialized preparation for war. Hun children learned riding and archery as basic life skills. Herding operations doubled as cavalry maneuvers. Hunting developed the coordination necessary for battlefield tactics. By the time a Hun warrior faced combat, he had spent his entire life preparing for that moment. The psychological impact of Hun warfare magnified their material advantages. Settled peoples found everything about Hun military practice alien and terrifying. They fought on horseback when Mediterranean armies still relied primarily on infantry. They used bows when Romans considered archery a specialized auxiliary function rather than the primary combat arm. They appeared and disappeared with bewildering speed, striking from unexpected directions and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Roman sources describe Huns as barely human, emphasizing their supposed ugliness, their diet of raw meat, and their inability to walk properly from spending entire lives on horseback. These descriptions reveal more about Roman anxieties than Hun realities. Faced with an enemy who violated all their assumptions about civilized warfare, Roman writers resorted to dehumanizing caricature that positioned Huns outside the category of rational opponents who could be understood and defeated through conventional military means. The reality was more complex and more threatening. The Huns represented a fully functional alternative to sedentary civilization, one that under the right circumstances could outcompete agricultural empires for control of resources and populations. Their success didn't stem from barbaric savagery, but from sophisticated adaptation to steppe environments and ruthlessly effective military systems. By 400, the Huns controlled territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Danube River. This expansion brought them into sustained contact with both halves of the Roman Empire and positioned them to intervene in Roman internal politics. The relationship between Huns and Romans during this period defies simple categories of ally or enemy. Hun warriors served in Roman armies as federate troops. Roman gold flowed to Hun leaders as diplomatic payments and military subsidies. Hun princes spent time at the imperial court, learning Roman languages and political customs. This interpenetration of Roman and Hun societies created opportunities for mutual manipulation. Romans hoped to bind Hun leaders through tributary payments and employment contracts, converting potential enemies into military assets. Hun leaders accepted Roman gold while maintaining strategic independence, using Roman resources to strengthen their position against both external enemies and internal rivals. The system worked only as long as both sides found it advantageous. Roman emperors could afford tributary payments during periods of internal stability and external peace. Hun leaders could maintain their authority as long as they delivered sufficient wealth to satisfy their followers. But this equilibrium was inherently unstable, vulnerable to disruption from succession crises, military defeats, or shifts in the relative power balance. The death of Uldin around 410 triggered one such crisis. This Hun leader had led successful campaigns into Roman territory, while also providing troops for Roman service. His death created a succession dispute that temporarily fragmented Hun power. allowing the Eastern Roman Empire to reduce tributary payments and reassert control over border regions. But this Roman success proved ephemeral. The Huns, who would emerge from this period of fragmentation under new leadership, would pose a far greater threat than anything Rome had yet encountered. That threat would take human form in two brothers who transformed the Hun Confederation from a regional power into an empire that could negotiate with Rome and China as equals. Their names were Bleda and Attila. The older brother would be murdered. The younger would become the most feared man in the ancient world, the scourge of God. The consolidation of Hun power under Rua around 420 created the foundation for everything that followed. This chieftain, whose name barely registers in popular memory, proved more consequential for Roman history than most emperors who occupied the throne during his lifetime. Rua understood something his predecessors had glimpsed but never fully exploited. The Roman Empire's true vulnerability wasn't military weakness, but psychological exhaustion. By the 420s, Rome had been fighting for survival for half a century. Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Alans, Sueves. Wave after wave of Germanic peoples had crossed the frontiers, some seeking refuge, others seeking plunder, all demanding accommodation within imperial territory. The Western Empire had lost Britain, most of Spain, Africa north of the Mediterranean coast. What remained was a rump state centered on Italy and southern Gaul, defended by armies composed largely of the same Germanic peoples who threatened it. The Eastern Empire appeared more stable, but faced equally severe pressures. Persian aggression on the eastern frontier required constant military vigilance and enormous financial expenditure. Religious controversies threatened to tear the empire apart from within as Christians debated the nature of Christ with a ferocity that occasionally erupted into urban violence. The imperial treasury struggled to maintain both a competitive military establishment and the elaborate bureaucratic apparatus required to govern what remained the ancient world's most complex administrative state. Rua recognized that Rome's problems created opportunities. The empire needed peace on the Danube frontier to concentrate resources elsewhere. That peace could be purchased, and Rua intended to name his price. He opened negotiations with both imperial courts simultaneously, playing Eastern and Western Romans against each other, while positioning himself as the arbiter of frontier stability. His demands were straightforward. Annual tribute payments in gold, the return of Hun refugees who had fled into Roman territory, the cessation of Roman alliances with peoples subject to Hun authority, recognition of Hun control over territories north of the Danube. These demands weren't revolutionary. Rome had been making similar arrangements with frontier peoples for centuries. What made Rua's approach different was scale and sophistication. He demanded payments measured in hundreds of pounds of gold annually, sums that strained imperial finances even during peacetime. He insisted on formal treaties that acknowledged him as an independent ruler, negotiating with Rome as an equal rather than a barbarian chieftain accepting Roman patronage. He enforced treaty terms ruthlessly, launching punitive expeditions whenever Rome failed to meet its obligations. The Romans had no choice but to comply. Rua's mounted armies could strike deep into imperial territory before Roman forces could respond effectively. His warriors didn't need to capture cities or hold territory. They simply needed to devastate the agricultural hinterland that fed urban populations and generated tax revenues. A single season of Hun raiding could produce economic damage that required years to repair. The tribute payments Rua demanded were cheaper than the cost of defending against his attacks. This arrangement suited both sides temporarily. Rua received gold that strengthened his authority within Hun society, while avoiding the casualties and risks inherent in sustained warfare against a still dangerous opponent. Rome purchased time to address more pressing problems elsewhere while maintaining the fiction that tributary payments represented gifts between allies rather than protection money extracted by superior force. But everyone understood the real nature of the relationship. Rome was paying the Huns not to destroy it. Rua died around 434, leaving power to his two nephews. The division of authority between Bleda and Attila has puzzled historians ever since. Steppe confederations typically concentrated power in a single supreme leader, whose authority derived from demonstrated military success and supernatural favor. Joint rule created obvious risks of rivalry and civil war. Yet the sources consistently describe Bleda and Attila as co-rulers during the first decade of their reign, jointly negotiating with Rome and apparently cooperating in military campaigns. The arrangement probably reflected political realities within Hun society that the sources don't adequately explain. Bleda may have been older and enjoyed support from conservative factions who valued traditional practices. Attila clearly possessed greater military ability and attracted younger warriors eager for glory and plunder. Neither brother commanded sufficient support to eliminate the other without triggering civil war that would destroy everything Rua had built. So they shared power, at least initially. Their first major act was to renegotiate the treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire. The meeting took place in 435 at Margus, a city on the Danube frontier. The Roman envoys expected routine discussions about tribute amounts and refugee returns. Instead, they confronted demands that revealed how thoroughly the power balance had shifted. Attila and Bleda demanded doubled tribute payments. They required the Romans to surrender all Hun refugees without exception, including those who had entered imperial service or converted to Christianity. They insisted that Rome cease all diplomatic contact with peoples subject to Hun authority. They demanded the right to trade in Roman border cities, a privilege that would give Hun merchants access to imperial markets while gathering intelligence about Roman military preparations. The Roman envoys protested that these demands exceeded anything previously accepted. The Hun brothers responded by threatening immediate war if the treaty wasn't ratified, exactly as proposed. The Romans, facing renewed Persian aggression in the east and unable to concentrate sufficient forces on the Danube, capitulated completely. The Treaty of Margus established Hun supremacy over the Eastern Roman Empire in everything but name. Rome would pay £700 of gold annually, an enormous sum that represented a substantial portion of imperial revenues. Roman officials would be required to surrender refugees on demand, even those who had committed no crime under Roman law. Roman diplomacy in the Danube region would operate only with Hun permission. The Western Roman Empire, weaker militarily but geographically more distant from Hun power centers, received more favorable terms. Aetius, the de facto ruler of what remained of the Western Empire, had personal connections with the Huns dating to his youth when he had lived as a hostage at Rua's court. He understood Hun political dynamics and possessed credibility with their leadership that Eastern Roman officials lacked. More importantly, Aetius actively employed Hun warriors as auxiliary troops in his campaigns against other Germanic peoples. This military cooperation gave the Western Empire leverage that the East couldn't match. The years following the Treaty of Margus revealed the treaty's true purpose. It wasn't primarily about gold, though the tribute payments were certainly welcome. It was about establishing a framework that legitimized Hun intervention in Roman internal affairs. Whenever Rome delayed tribute payments or provided inadequate explanations for treaty violations, the Huns had legal justification for military action. The treaty transformed what had been frontier raiding into the enforcement of international law. The Huns exploited this framework ruthlessly. In 441, they claimed that the Bishop of Margus had crossed into Hun territory and desecrated royal graves to steal treasure. They demanded the bishop's surrender. When Roman authorities refused, citing religious law that protected clergy from secular punishment, the Huns declared the treaty void and launched a massive invasion. Within weeks, They had captured Margus, Singidunum, and multiple other frontier cities. Roman forces that attempted to relieve these sieges were defeated in detail. By 442, Hun armies had penetrated as far as Thrace, threatening Constantinople itself. The Eastern Roman Empire's response exposed its fundamental weakness. Emperor Theodosius II couldn't concentrate sufficient military forces to defeat the Huns because most of the Eastern field army was engaged against Persia. He couldn't negotiate from strength because the Huns had already demonstrated their ability to devastate imperial territory at will. He couldn't even effectively defend Constantinople because the city's land walls, though formidable, had been damaged by earthquakes and required repairs that would take months to complete. So he sued for peace on whatever terms the Huns would accept. Those terms were humiliating. The annual tribute was tripled to £2,100 of gold. Rome was required to pay £6,000 of gold immediately as arrears for missed payments and war indemnity. The Romans had to surrender a strip of territory south of the Danube, 5 days' journey wide, creating a buffer zone that would be kept empty of Roman settlement. The empire was forbidden to accept Hun refugees under any circumstances. Roman merchants were banned from Hun territory, while Hun merchants received unrestricted access to Roman markets. These weren't the terms of a treaty between equals. They were the conditions imposed by a victorious power on a defeated enemy. The Eastern Roman Empire had become a tributary state, paying protection money to a steppe confederation that could destroy it whenever compliance flagged. The psychological impact of this reversal exceeded even the financial burden. Rome, which had conquered the Mediterranean world and humbled Carthage and Macedon, was now paying tribute to nomadic horsemen from the Central Asian steppes. Yet even as Rome suffered this humiliation, the Hun Confederation was approaching its own moment of crisis. Bleda disappeared from the historical record around 445. The sources provide various explanations for his fate. The Roman historian Priscus claims Attila murdered his brother to consolidate power. Other accounts suggest Bleda died naturally or was killed in battle. What matters is that Attila emerged from this period as sole ruler of the Hun Confederation, free to pursue policies without the constraints that shared leadership had imposed. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Where Bleda and Attila together had been cautious and calculating, Attila alone proved aggressive and unpredictable. The annual tribute payments that had satisfied the brothers suddenly became insufficient. Attila demanded additional payments for specific purposes, claiming that Rome owed him compensation for various treaty violations. He insisted on personal meetings with high-ranking Roman officials, requiring senators and generals to travel to his camp and conduct negotiations under conditions designed to emphasize their subordinate status. He intervened in Roman internal politics, supporting usurpers and demanding the exile of officials who opposed Hun interests. This escalation reflected Attila's understanding of power dynamics within both Hun and Roman societies. Among the Huns, a leader's authority depended on his ability to deliver wealth and military success to his followers. The tribute payments from Rome, while substantial, had to be distributed among the various chieftains and warrior bands that composed the confederation. Attila needed to continually increase the flow of Roman gold to maintain his position and prevent rivals from challenging his authority. Simple maintenance of the status quo meant political decline. Among the Romans, Attila recognized that the empire's apparent strength masked profound internal weaknesses. The eastern and western halves of the empire barely cooperated with each other and sometimes actively worked at cross purposes. The senatorial aristocracy that controlled most of the empire's wealth often prioritized protecting its own interests over defending the state. The army, composed largely of Germanic federates who felt little loyalty to Rome, would fight only if regularly paid and competently led. The urban populations, dependent on grain distributions and public entertainment, would riot if their expectations weren't met. This wasn't a coherent political community capable of sustained resistance. It was a collection of competing interest groups held together by institutional inertia and shared fear of what might replace Roman order. Attila intended to exploit every one of these weaknesses, but he also understood that the Huns faced their own constraints. His confederation was powerful, but not limitless. Every warrior committed to campaigning in Roman territory was unavailable for operations elsewhere. Every casualty suffered fighting Roman armies was a warrior who couldn't defend Hun territory against other steppe peoples. Every season spent besieging fortified cities was a season when the herds weren't being properly managed and tribal territories weren't being adequately supervised. The Huns could defeat Roman field armies and devastate Roman provinces, but they couldn't actually govern the territories they conquered. Their entire military system depended on mobility and shock action, advantages that disappeared the moment they tried to hold and administer fixed territories. This created a fundamental strategic problem. Attila could hurt Rome badly, but he couldn't destroy it. He could extract enormous tribute payments, but those payments depended on maintaining a functioning Roman economy, capable of generating the tax revenues that funded them. He could threaten Constantinople and Ravenna, but actually capturing and holding these heavily fortified cities would require siege capabilities the Huns didn't possess, and casualties they couldn't afford. He commanded the most powerful military force in Europe, yet that force couldn't achieve decisive strategic victory against an empire that, for all its weakness, still controlled more resources and population than any steppe confederation could match. The solution Attila devised to this dilemma would define the final decade of his life and determine the fate of the Western Roman Empire. He would transform the Huns from a frontier threat into an empire-destroying catastrophe. But first he needed to understand his enemy better than his enemy understood itself. That understanding would come from an unexpected source, a diplomatic mission to Constantinople that would reveal both the depths of Roman desperation and the opportunities that desperation created. The embassy arrived in Constantinople during the spring of 441, and Attila sent one of his most trusted subordinates to lead it. The ostensible purpose was routine: discuss the return of fugitives who had fled Hun territory and negotiated tribute arrangements. The actual purpose was intelligence gathering on a scale the Eastern Roman court completely failed to recognize. The Hun envoys spent weeks in the capital, observing everything. They saw how the Theodosian walls enclosed the city in seemingly impregnable fortifications, with triple layers of defenses that had never been breached. They noted the harbour facilities that kept Constantinople supplied by sea, making starvation blockades impossible. They observed the palace bureaucracy that administered the empire's eastern territories, counting the officials and assessing their competence. They attended ceremonial functions where the emperor appeared in elaborate regalia designed to project divine authority and imperial permanence. What they discovered was more valuable than military intelligence. They found an empire paralyzed by its own complexity. The Eastern Roman government operated through layers of bureaucracy that made rapid decision-making nearly impossible. Any significant policy change required consensus among competing factions: the emperor's court, the military command, the senatorial aristocracy, and the church hierarchy. These groups spent more energy fighting each other than addressing external threats. The Emperor Theodosius II, then in his 40th year of rule, had never commanded an army or made a major independent decision. He preferred theology and palace intrigue to governance. The military situation was even more revealing. The Eastern Field Army, theoretically numbering over 100,000 men, existed primarily on paper. Actual combat-ready forces were scattered across multiple frontiers: the Persian border, the Danube frontier, Egypt, and various internal security duties. Concentrating enough troops to face the Huns would require stripping other borders bare, inviting attacks from Persia or internal revolts. The generals commanding these dispersed forces competed for imperial favor and resources rather than coordinating defensive strategies. Most importantly, The embassy discovered the empire's financial vulnerability. The Eastern government's revenue came overwhelmingly from taxes on agricultural land and urban commerce. These taxes funded everything: the army, the bureaucracy, the grain distribution that kept Constantinople's population fed, and the elaborate court ceremonial that legitimized imperial authority. The entire system depended on maintaining regular tax collection across the empire's eastern provinces. Those provinces could be reached by Hun cavalry. Attila absorbed these reports with the strategic insight that separated him from every other barbarian leader Rome had faced. He understood that the Eastern Empire's strength was also its weakness. The elaborate administrative machinery that generated Rome's wealth required peace and stability to function. Disrupt that machinery, and the revenue stream dried up. Without revenue, the army couldn't be paid. Without pay, the army wouldn't fight. The whole structure could collapse not through military conquest, but through economic strangulation. He began planning accordingly. But first, he needed to test Roman responses and train his commanders in operations against fortified positions. The target he selected was perfect for both purposes: the Danubian provinces, where Roman cities were wealthy enough to be worth plundering, but not strong enough to offer serious resistance. The campaign began in 441 with devastating efficiency. Hun armies crossed the Danube and struck the fortified city of Viminacium before Roman commanders even realized an attack was coming. The city fell within days, its garrison overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the assault. Attila's forces moved on immediately, not bothering to garrison what they'd captured. They were there to destroy, not occupy. City after city fell in rapid succession: Margus, Singidunum, Sirmium. Each assault taught the Huns more about siege warfare. They learned to use captured Roman engineers to construct siege equipment. They discovered that starving a city into submission took too long, but concentrated archery could suppress defenders on the walls long enough for assault teams to breach gates. They found that threatening massacre if a city resisted usually convinced the garrison to negotiate surrender rather than fight to the death. The Romans responded exactly as Attila had predicted: slowly, ineffectively, and with forces too dispersed to matter. By the time Eastern field armies reached the Danube, the Huns had already devastated the region and withdrawn beyond the river. The Roman commanders declared victory and returned to their bases. Attila had lost perhaps a few hundred warriors. Rome had lost 7 major cities and the agricultural production of an entire province. More importantly, Attila had demonstrated to every frontier commander in the Eastern Empire that Roman field armies couldn't protect them. When the Huns came, they would be on their own. That knowledge would prove more valuable than any amount of plunder. The next year brought a peace embassy from Constantinople, offering increased tribute in exchange for Hun withdrawal. The terms were staggering: £700 of gold annually, with £6,000 in immediate back payments for tribute the Romans claimed to have already paid. Attila accepted, knowing he could always resume attacks whenever the payments stopped or Rome showed weakness. He used the breathing space to restructure his confederation. The traditional Hun tribal organization, with its independent chieftains and warrior bands, needed to evolve into something more centralized and controllable. Attila began appointing his own loyalists to command positions, gradually replacing tribal leaders whose authority derived from their own followers with commanders who owed everything to him personally. He created a permanent military staff that planned campaigns year-round rather than organizing raids seasonally. He established supply systems that could sustain armies in the field for months at a time. This transformation met resistance from traditional Hun chiefs who saw their independence eroding. Attila dealt with opposition through a combination of generosity towards supporters and ruthless elimination of rivals. Chiefs who accepted the new system received choice territories and shares of Roman tribute. Those who resisted faced manufactured accusations of treason, followed by execution and redistribution of their followers to loyal commanders. Within 3 years, Attila had converted a loose tribal confederation into something approaching a centralized military monarchy. The change was incomplete and always fragile. Steppe politics allowed no permanent victory, but it gave him capabilities no previous Hun leader had possessed. In 447, he put those capabilities to use in a campaign that nearly broke the Eastern Empire. The assault began in spring with multiple Hun armies crossing the Danube simultaneously at different points. This wasn't a raid. It was an invasion coordinated on a scale barbarian forces had never before achieved against Rome. One army drove south toward Constantinople itself, while others swept east and west along the Danube frontier, preventing Roman forces from concentrating against any single threat. The strategic objective was brilliant. Attila didn't intend to capture Constantinople. He knew the Theodosian walls made that impossible with the forces he commanded. Instead, he would devastate the Balkan provinces that generated much of the Eastern Empire's tax revenue. Without that revenue, Constantinople couldn't maintain its field armies or pay the subsidies that kept other barbarian groups peaceful. The empire would have to negotiate from a position of total weakness. The campaign devastated everything in its path. Contemporary sources, probably exaggerated but indicative of scale, claim the Huns destroyed more than 70 cities. Archaeological evidence confirms massive destruction layers at multiple sites dating to this period. The Huns learned to take fortified positions through a combination of siegecraft and terror. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely, their populations massacred or enslaved. Cities that surrendered immediately might be ransomed back to their inhabitants. Roman field armies that attempted to confront the invasion were systematically destroyed. At the Battle of the Utus River, Hun cavalry shattered a Roman force that sources describe as one of the largest armies the Eastern Empire had fielded in decades. The Roman commanders, incompetent and inexperienced in fighting steppe peoples, arranged their infantry in traditional formations that Hun horse archers simply rode around and destroyed from a distance. By summer, Hun forces reached the outskirts of Constantinople itself. They couldn't breach the Theodosian walls, but they didn't need to. The city's population, swollen with refugees from the devastated provinces, faced potential starvation if the siege continued. The government's revenue had collapsed as the Balkan provinces, the empire's richest agricultural region, lay in ruins. Theodosius had no choice but to negotiate. The resulting treaty was the most humiliating Rome had signed in centuries. The annual tribute tripled to £2,100 of gold. A zone 5 days' march south of the Danube had to be completely evacuated by Roman civilians and troops, creating a permanent buffer under Hun control. Any Roman fugitives in Hun territory would be ransomed at 12 gold pieces per person, an enormous sum that effectively meant they'd never be recovered. The financial burden was crushing. The Eastern government had to impose emergency taxes that generated revolts in provinces the Huns hadn't even reached. The senatorial aristocracy, forced to contribute to the tribute payments, began looking for ways to avoid their obligations or overthrow the emperor who'd imposed them. The military, demoralized and defeated, saw its budget cut to fund the Hun payments, making it even less capable of future resistance. Attila had achieved something no barbarian leader before him had managed. He'd made the Roman Empire pay for its own defense by funding the forces that threatened it. The tribute payments strengthened the Hun Confederation while weakening Rome's ability to resist. Every gold solidus sent north meant one fewer Roman soldier equipped, one less fortification repaired, one more administrative function that couldn't be maintained. But Attila recognized that this arrangement had a limited lifespan. The Eastern Empire was exhausted and compliant for now, but it would eventually recover. New emperors would come to power, new generals would emerge, and the bureaucratic machinery would adapt to the new reality. The tribute payments, while substantial, weren't enough to maintain his expanded confederation indefinitely. His subordinate commanders, enriched by the Balkan campaigns, would expect similar rewards in future. The warrior bands that had followed him to victory would drift away if he couldn't provide continued success. He needed a new target, one that could provide the plunder and prestige necessary to maintain his position. The Eastern Empire was temporarily exhausted, but the Western Empire, weaker and more divided, offered opportunities that were becoming too attractive to ignore. The decision to turn west wasn't made suddenly. Throughout the late 440s, Attila maintained diplomatic contact with the Western court at Ravenna, probing for weaknesses and opportunities. He discovered a situation even more chaotic than the East. The Western Emperor Valentinian III was a non-entity controlled by his mother and his magister Militum Aetius. The senatorial aristocracy of Italy and Gaul operated essentially independently, paying taxes only when forced and maintaining private armies that rivaled the imperial forces. The provinces were a patchwork of Roman administration, barbarian federates, and outright rebel territories. Most intriguingly, Aetius himself had lived among the Huns as a hostage in his youth and maintained personal relationships with Hun commanders. He'd even used Hun mercenary forces in his campaigns against other barbarian groups and Roman rivals. This created a bizarre situation where the Western Empire's leading general had closer ties to Attila than to some of his own subordinates. Attila cultivated these connections carefully. He sent embassies to Ravenna, not demanding tribute, but instead offering friendship and alliance against mutual enemies. He provided Hun mercenaries to support Aetius in his campaigns, building a relationship that made the Western general dependent on Hun military support. He learned everything about Western politics, military capabilities, and the personal rivalries that fractured the imperial government. By 450, he was ready to move. The opportunity came from an unexpected source: a desperate letter from Honoria, the emperor's sister, offering marriage and claiming she was being forced into an unwanted union with a Roman senator. Whether Honoria actually intended to marry Attila or was simply making a dramatic gesture to escape an arranged marriage didn't matter. Attila seized on the letter as legal justification for claiming half the Western Empire as Honoria's dowry. The claim was absurd by any reasonable standard, but Attila didn't need legal validity. He needed a pretext that would let him present the coming invasion as something other than naked aggression, a pretext that would divide Roman opinion and make it harder for Aetius to organize unified resistance. The strategy was working before the first Hun warrior crossed into Gaul. The invasion of Gaul in 451 revealed something fundamental about Attila's strategic thinking that historians often miss. He wasn't trying to conquer and hold territory in the way Rome understood conquest. He was engineering a massive raid designed to extract maximum wealth, while simultaneously demonstrating to his own followers that the Western Empire offered richer targets than the exhausted East. The difference mattered enormously for how the campaign unfolded. Attila crossed the Rhine with perhaps 50,000 warriors, though ancient sources inflate this to absurd numbers. He moved through northeastern Gaul systematically, targeting wealthy cities that had largely escaped the devastation other regions had suffered. Metz, Rams, Trier, each fell in turn. But the pattern of destruction was selective. Cities that surrendered immediately and provided supplies were often spared the worst violence. Those that resisted were destroyed so thoroughly that archaeological evidence of the Hun passage appears as distinct burn layers in the excavation record. This wasn't mindless barbarian fury. Attila was sending a message to every city ahead of his advance. Resistance meant annihilation. Cooperation meant survival. The strategy worked brilliantly. Gaul's urban centers, long accustomed to buying off barbarian threats, understood the calculation perfectly. Many opened their gates without fighting. The plunder flowed back across the Rhine in wagon trains that stretched for miles. Yet Attila made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that Aetius dependent on Hun mercenaries for so many years, would either remain neutral or offer only token resistance. Instead, the Roman general recognized that Attila's invasion threatened the entire basis of his own power. If the Huns could plunder Gaul at will, Aetius became irrelevant. His carefully constructed network of barbarian allies, his reputation as the man who could manage the impossible complexity of Western politics, all of it collapsed if he couldn't protect the tax base that sustained the imperial government. Aetius responded by assembling the strangest army late antiquity ever saw. His core force consisted of the regular Roman field army, perhaps 15,000 men. To this he added his Visigothic federates under King Theodoric, traditional Roman enemies who now fought alongside imperial troops, Alan cavalry, Burgundian infantry, Frankish warbands, Saxon auxiliaries. The army that marched to confront Attila represented virtually every major power in Western Europe united against a common threat. The two forces met near Chalons in northeastern Gaul, though the exact location remains debated. Ancient sources call it the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, and they describe carnage on a scale that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to violence. What actually happened on that summer day in 451 is harder to determine than you might expect. Our sources, written decades later by authors with clear agendas, agree on the basic outcome, but contradict each other on crucial details. The battle probably began in the afternoon, with both sides maneuvering for advantage on rolling terrain that offered no clear defensive positions. Attila placed his Huns in the centre, surrounded by his Germanic allies and subject peoples. Aetius positioned his Romans on one wing, the Visigoths on the other, with his less reliable allies holding the centre. The initial clashes went badly for the coalition. Hun horse archers, executing the tactics that had terrorized Europe for decades, shredded the Allied centre. But something unexpected happened on the flanks. The Visigothic cavalry, heavy horsemen who fought in close formation rather than as skirmishers, crashed into the Hun left wing with devastating impact. Their king Theodoric died in the fighting, but his son Thorismund rallied the warriors and drove the Huns backward. Simultaneously, Aetius pressed forward on the opposite wing, threatening to envelop Attila's position. Night fell, with the outcome still uncertain. Attila withdrew to his wagon lager, the circular formation of wagons that steppe nomads used as mobile fortifications. He prepared for a final stand, reportedly ordering a funeral pyre built from saddles so he could immolate himself rather than be captured. But Aetius didn't attack the next morning. Instead, he negotiated. The reasons for this decision have puzzled historians for centuries. The standard explanation is that Aetius feared his Visigothic allies would become too powerful if the Huns were completely destroyed, that he needed Attila as a counterweight to other barbarian threats. Maybe, but there's a simpler explanation rooted in military reality. Attacking a desperate enemy in a fortified position would have cost Aetius casualties he couldn't afford. His army was a coalition of rivals held together by temporary common interest. Heavy losses might have caused it to disintegrate, so Attila was allowed to withdraw. He crossed back over the Rhine with his army intact and most of his plunder secured. By any reasonable measure, he'd achieved his objectives. Gaul had been thoroughly terrorized, enormous wealth had been extracted, and his confederation remained united and formidable. Yet something had changed. The myth of Hun invincibility, so carefully cultivated over decades, had been damaged. His subject, peoples had seen Hun warriors driven from the field. His own commanders had witnessed coalition forces that could match them in battle. The question became, what to do next? The Eastern Empire remained exhausted and compliant, continuing its tribute payments. Gaul had been milked dry and was now defended by Aetius's coalition. But Italy, wealthy Italy, had been largely untouched by decades of warfare that had devastated other provinces. The senatorial estates, the cities of the Po Valley, the accumulated wealth of centuries, all sat virtually undefended behind the Alps. Attila invaded Italy in 452. The decision made strategic sense on multiple levels. Italy offered plunder that could restore his prestige after the qualified success in Gaul. The peninsula's geography favoured his style of warfare, with river valleys providing natural invasion routes and flat terrain in the north ideal for cavalry operations. Most importantly, the Western imperial government was even weaker than it had been a year earlier. Aetius had disbanded most of his coalition army after Chalons, unable to afford keeping it in the field. The invasion began in early spring, earlier than traditional campaigning season, catching the Romans unprepared. Aquileia, the great fortress city guarding the approaches to Italy, fell after a siege that ancient sources describe in dramatic but contradictory terms. What's clear is that Aquileia's destruction was so complete that the city never recovered. Its population fled to the lagoons that would eventually become Venice. From Aquileia, Attila moved southwest through the wealthy cities of northern Italy. Padua, Vicenza, Verona, each fell in turn. Milan, the former imperial capital, surrendered without resistance. The pattern from Gaul repeated itself. Cities that submitted immediately were spared the worst, those still thoroughly plundered. Those that resisted were obliterated. The Hun advance seemed unstoppable. Aetius had no field army capable of confronting Attila in open battle. The imperial government at Ravenna, protected by marshes and fortifications, could do nothing but watch as the richest parts of Italy were systematically stripped of wealth. Refugees flooded south, bringing tales of devastation that grew more horrific with each retelling. Then Attila stopped. At the Po River, with the road to Rome open before him, he halted his advance and entered into negotiations with a Roman embassy. The delegation was led by Pope Leo I, and later Christian sources would claim that the Pope's spiritual authority convinced Attila to spare Rome. The reality was more complex and more interesting. Several factors combined to make Attila receptive to negotiation. Disease had broken out among his forces, probably malaria or dysentery spread by the summer heat, and poor sanitation in the military camps. His supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, were vulnerable to interdiction. Intelligence reports indicated that the Eastern Empire was assembling forces to attack his homeland while his main army was committed in Italy. Most critically, the plunder from northern Italy, while substantial, was becoming difficult to transport and defend. The negotiations produced a face-saving compromise. Attila would withdraw from Italy in exchange for renewed tribute payments and recognition of his territorial claims. Rome would be spared, allowing Christian propagandists to later credit Pope Leo with miraculous intervention. The Western government could claim it had defended Italy through diplomacy rather than military force. Everyone got to declare victory while avoiding further costly conflict. Attila returned across the Alps in autumn 452 with his army intact and wagon trains loaded with Italian wealth. He demonstrated once again that Roman territory could be raided virtually at will, that imperial defences were inadequate to protect even the heartland. His position seemed secure, the confederation had been enriched, potential challengers cowed, and both halves of the Roman Empire reduced to tributary status. He began planning for 453. The Eastern Empire would be the target, he decided. Constantinople's tribute payments had become irregular, suggesting the government felt strong enough to resist Hun demands. A quick campaign across the Danube, some highly visible destruction of border cities, and the payments would resume. It was a pattern he'd executed successfully multiple times. But in early 453, at a feast celebrating his marriage to a young woman named Ildico, Attila died. The circumstances remain mysterious. The official account, preserved by the Gothic historian Jordanes, claims he suffered a severe nosebleed during the wedding night and choked on his own blood while lying in a drunken stupor. Later sources suggest assassination, possibly by the bride herself or by Roman agents. Medical historians have proposed ruptured esophageal varices, a condition common in heavy drinkers. What actually killed him matters less than what happened immediately after. His sons divided the confederation among themselves and promptly began fighting over the shares. Subject peoples, held in check by Attila's personal authority and military reputation, saw their opportunity. The Gepids, a Germanic people who'd served as Hun auxiliaries for decades, revolted first. At the Battle of Nidau in 454, they defeated a Hun army and killed Attila's eldest son, Elac. The confederation disintegrated with stunning speed. Germanic peoples who'd fought as Hun subjects for generations reasserted their independence. The Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Rugi, the Siri, all carved out their own territories from what had been Hun-controlled lands. Attila's surviving sons led their followers eastward, back toward the steppes from which their ancestors had emerged a century earlier. Within a decade of Attila's death, the Hun threat to Europe had effectively ended. Some groups remained in the Balkans and along the Danube frontier, occasionally serving as Roman mercenaries. But the Great Confederation that had terrorized two empires and extracted tribute from the richest civilization in the Mediterranean world was gone. The collapse revealed something crucial about the nature of steppe confederations. They were built on success, held together by the personal authority of charismatic leaders who could deliver plunder and victory. Remove that leader, break the momentum of continuous military success, and the entire structure came apart. The Huns hadn't been building an empire in the Roman sense, with permanent administrative structures and territorial control. They'd been operating a protection racket that required constant demonstration of power to maintain. Yet, Attila's impact on Europe extended far beyond his lifetime. The devastation of the Balkans during his campaigns depopulated regions that wouldn't recover for centuries. The weakening of Roman frontier defences accelerated the settlement of Germanic peoples throughout the Western Empire. The tribute payments extracted from both halves of the empire drained resources that might have been used for military reorganization or administrative reform. More subtly, Attila had demonstrated that Roman military power, the force that had dominated Europe for centuries, could be systematically defeated by enemies who understood its limitations. The tactics he'd perfected, the diplomatic strategies he'd employed, the exploitation of Roman internal divisions, all of these became templates that future enemies would study and adapt. The Germanic kingdoms that emerged from the empire's ruins in the late 5th century had all learned from watching Attila operate. They understood that Roman armies could be avoided or defeated, that Roman diplomacy could be manipulated, that Roman wealth could be extracted through threats rather than conquest. The Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy, all employed strategies that Attila had pioneered. For the Romans themselves, Attila represented a nightmare that shaped policy decisions for decades. The Eastern Empire, traumatized by the Balkan devastation, reorganized its military and diplomatic systems specifically to prevent any future steppe confederation from achieving similar power. The massive fortification programs, the sophisticated intelligence networks, the careful management of barbarian rivals, all reflected lessons learned from the Hun crisis. Word count, 2,286. The Western Empire, already fragmenting under pressure from multiple Germanic peoples, never recovered from the resource drain and military chaos of the Attila years. By 476, just 23 years after the Hun leader's death, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed by a Germanic general. Historians still debate how much Attila's campaigns contributed to that final collapse versus other factors like economic decline, administrative breakdown, and internal political dysfunction. But there's no question that the Hun invasion's accelerated processes already underway. The image of Attila himself underwent remarkable transformations in the centuries following his death. To Roman writers like Jordanes, composing his Gothic history a century later, Attila became a divine scourge sent to punish Roman sins. This theological interpretation, filtering events through Christian frameworks, portrayed the Hun leader as an instrument of God's judgment rather than simply a foreign invader. The characterizations stuck, giving us the enduring epithet, Scourge of God, that Attila probably never claimed for himself. Germanic peoples who'd fought under Hun authority, or against it, developed their own traditions about Attila. The Ostrogoths, who'd spent decades as Hun subjects before regaining independence, preserved memories in oral traditions that eventually influenced written epics. The Nibelungenlied, composed in medieval Germany, features Attila as Etzel, a powerful but somewhat distant figure hosting the catastrophic events that destroy the Burgundian heroes. He's portrayed neither as villain nor hero, but as a great king whose court serves as the stage for Germanic tragedy. Norse sagas took these traditions even further. The Volsunga saga presents Attila as Atli, a treacherous king who murders his brothers-in-law for their treasure, only to be killed in revenge by his wife. These stories bear little resemblance to historical events, but they reveal how Attila's reputation as a powerful ruler persisted in Germanic cultural memory, transformed and adapted to serve different narrative purposes across generations. Medieval European chronicles, drawing on limited sources and considerable imagination, created increasingly fantastical versions of Attila's life and campaigns. Some portrayed him as a giant of superhuman strength. Others claimed he wielded a magical sword that guaranteed victory in battle. These elaborations reflected medieval fascination with legendary warriors and divine intervention in human affairs, projecting contemporary values and concerns onto a distant historical figure. Hungarian national mythology developed particularly strong connections to Attila, claiming him as a predecessor to the Magyar peoples who settled the Carpathian Basin in the 9th century. This identification, historically questionable since Magyars and Huns were distinct peoples, served important political and cultural functions. It provided Hungarians with an ancient pedigree connecting them to one of history's most formidable military leaders, legitimizing their presence in Central Europe and their conflicts with Germanic neighbors. The connection became so embedded in Hungarian national consciousness that medieval Hungarian chronicles traced royal genealogies back to Attila. Kings claimed descent from the Hun ruler to bolster their authority. The association persisted into modern times, with Attila remaining a figure of national pride, despite the historical problems with claiming direct continuity between Huns and Magyars. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence for the Huns themselves remained frustratingly sparse. Unlike settled civilizations that left behind cities, monuments, and extensive written records, steppe nomads travelled light. They built in wood and felt rather than stone. They buried their dead with grave goods, but these burials are difficult to identify with certainty and easy to miss in archaeological surveys of vast territories. What we can identify as definitively Hun material culture is limited. Certain styles of metalwork, particularly bronze cauldrons and elaborate bow fittings, appear in contexts associated with Hun presence. Artificially deformed skulls, created by binding infants' heads, show up in burials from Hun period contexts, reflecting a cultural practice that distinguished certain groups, but connecting specific archaeological finds to the Huns, rather than other steppe peoples or their Germanic subjects, requires careful analysis and often remains speculative. The famous treasure of Nagyszent Miklós, discovered in Hungary and now in Vienna, illustrates these identification problems. The hoard contains magnificent gold vessels decorated with figures and animals in styles that might reflect Hun artistic traditions, or they might be later Avar work, or they might represent Byzantine craftsmanship made for steppe clients. Scholars still argue about dating, attribution, and cultural connections, demonstrating how difficult it is to pin down material evidence for peoples who left few archaeological traces. Attila's burial site has never been found despite centuries of speculation and searching. According to Jordanes, the Huns diverted a river, buried their leader in the riverbed with enormous treasure, then returned the water to its course and killed everyone who'd participated in the burial to keep the location secret. It's a great story, emphasizing the extraordinary measures taken to protect Attila's resting place. Whether it's true is another question entirely. The search for Attila's tomb became something of an obsession for treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists over the centuries. Various locations across Hungary and beyond have been proposed based on local traditions, geographical features, or hopeful interpretation of limited evidence. None has produced convincing results. If the tomb exists and wasn't looted in antiquity, it remains hidden, probably forever. What we know about Hun culture beyond warfare comes mostly from descriptions by outsiders, which means it's filtered through Roman and Greek cultural assumptions and literary conventions. Priscus's account of his embassy to Attila's court provides the most detailed contemporary description, but even he was observing through the lens of a Byzantine diplomat, comparing everything to his own civilization's practices. From these sources, we learn that Huns practiced a form of shamanism with priests who predicted the future through divination. They valued horses above all other possessions, using them for transportation, warfare, food, and even ritual sacrifice. Their diet centered on meat and milk products, supplemented by grain obtained through trade or tribute. They drank kumis, fermented mare's milk, and imported wine when they could get it. Hun's social organization revolved around extended family groups and military bands bound by personal loyalty to successful leaders. Status derived from military prowess and the ability to distribute plunder. Attila's court, by the time Priscus visited, had absorbed considerable Roman influence in its ceremonial aspects and administrative practices, but maintained steppe traditions in its fundamental structure. The role of women in Hun society remains poorly documented. We know Attila had multiple wives, both for political alliances and personal reasons. His mother Obasius apparently wielded significant influence during his early reign. But whether Hun women generally had more or less freedom and authority than their Roman or Germanic counterparts is unclear from surviving sources. Language poses another frustrating problem. We have almost no direct evidence of the Hun language. A handful of personal names preserved in Greek and Latin sources, a few possible loanwords that entered Germanic languages, and that's essentially it. Linguists have proposed connections to various language families, Turkic, Mongolic, Yeniseian, but without substantial evidence. All reconstructions remain highly speculative. This linguistic gap means we can't access Hun perspectives on their own history and culture except as filtered through foreign sources. We don't know what they called themselves, what stories they told about their origins, how they understood their relationship to the peoples they conquered, or the empires they threatened. We're left with outsider descriptions and the material traces of their passage through European history. The Huns' military legacy proved more enduring than their political structures. The composite recurve bow they used so effectively became standard equipment for steppe warriors for centuries afterward. Their tactics of feigned retreat, surrounding maneuvers, and harassment of slower-moving infantry influenced cavalry warfare across Eurasia. Byzantine military manuals from centuries after Attila's death still discussed Hun fighting methods as exemplars of mobile warfare. The strategic approach of using speed and mobility to offset numerical disadvantages, exploiting enemy weaknesses rather than confronting strengths, and combining military pressure with diplomatic manipulation became standard practice for steppe confederations that followed. The Avars, who appeared in Europe a century after the Huns' collapse, employed remarkably similar methods. So did the Magyars, the Pechenegs, the Cumans, and ultimately the Mongols, who perfected these approaches to an extent that made even Attila's achievements look modest. European responses to steppe threats evolved directly from lessons learned during the Hun invasions. The Byzantine Empire developed sophisticated frontier defense systems designed specifically to counter fast-moving cavalry armies. They built networks of fortified cities that couldn't be quickly overrun, maintained intelligence services to provide early warning of steppe movements, and cultivated rival groups to prevent any single confederation from achieving dominance. This strategic approach, refined over centuries of dealing with successive steppe peoples, allowed Byzantium to survive threats that destroyed the Western Empire. The difference wasn't primarily military technology or tactical superiority. It was systematic application of lessons learned from Attila and his successors about how to manage steppe threats through combined military, diplomatic, and economic strategies. Western European kingdoms, lacking Byzantium's resources and organizational capacity, developed different responses. They relied more heavily on fortifications, transforming their landscapes with castles and walled cities that could withstand cavalry raids. They gradually shifted toward heavier cavalry themselves, developing the mounted warrior traditions that would eventually produce medieval knighthood. These adaptations took centuries, but they reflected lessons initially learned through devastating contact with Hun warfare. The psychological impact of the Hun invasions resonated through European culture for generations. The sudden appearance of an unknown people from the eastern steppes, speaking strange languages and fighting in unfamiliar ways, created lasting anxieties about threats from beyond civilization's borders. These fears found expression in chronicles, legends, and eventually literature that portrayed the East as a source of terrifying military power that could erupt without warning to destroy settled societies. These cultural memories influenced European responses to later steppe peoples. When the Mongols appeared in the 13th century, European chronicles immediately drew parallels to the Huns, describing them in similar terms and predicting similar devastation. The comparison was historically questionable. Mongols and Huns were completely unrelated peoples separated by 8 centuries, but it reflected deep-seated European anxieties about steppe invasions that trace back to Attila's era. Modern scholarship on the Huns and Attila has had to work through layers of legend, propaganda, and cultural memory to reach historical reality. The process remains incomplete, and probably always will be, given the limited and problematic nature of surviving sources. But the outlines are clear enough to understand what happened and why it mattered. Attila emerges from this scholarship as neither the demonic destroyer of Christian legend nor the noble savage of romantic imagination. He was a pragmatic leader who understood both steppe and Roman political systems well enough to exploit them effectively. He built a confederation that maximized the military potential of diverse peoples while extracting wealth from more developed civilizations through threats and occasional demonstrations of force. His success depended on specific historical circumstances, Roman internal divisions, the availability of Germanic peoples seeking opportunity within Hun structures, and the military effectiveness of steppe cavalry against Roman infantry. When those circumstances changed, when Romans reorganized their defenses, and Attila's death removed his personal authority, the confederation collapsed with remarkable speed, yet the impact persisted. The Huns under Attila had demonstrated vulnerabilities in Roman power that could never be completely repaired. They'd accelerated the transformation of Europe from a Roman-dominated world to one where Germanic kingdoms controlled former imperial territories. They'd established patterns of steppe empire interaction that would repeat for centuries, and they'd created a legend that outlived historical reality. Attila became a symbol, interpreted and reinterpreted by successive generations to serve their own purposes. Christian moralist, Germanic hero, Hungarian ancestor, Asian conqueror, the historical figure disappeared beneath layers of meaning that revealed more about those doing the interpreting than about the man himself. This process of legendary transformation began almost immediately after Attila's death and continues today. Every era creates its own Attila, projecting contemporary concerns and values onto a distant figure who left too little direct evidence to contradict the interpretations. The scourge of God, the noble barbarian, the prototype for later Asian conquerors. All these versions contain fragments of historical truth, wrapped in much larger packages of cultural meaning. Understanding this distinction between historical Attila and legendary Attila is crucial for making sense of his enduring presence in Western consciousness. The man who died in 453 was a successful steppe leader who built a powerful but unstable confederation and exploited Roman weakness effectively for about 2 decades. The figure who appears in chronicles, legends, and modern popular culture is something else entirely, a symbol of barbarian threat that serves purposes having little to do with 5th century history. The separation between historical reality and cultural legend creates particular challenges when examining how different societies have claimed Attila for their own national narratives. Hungarian nationalism found in him a founding figure who supposedly established Magyar identity and legitimized Hungarian claims to the Carpathian Basin. This interpretation required considerable historical creativity, since the Huns disappeared centuries before Magyars arrived in the region. But it served powerful political purposes during the formation of modern Hungarian identity in the 19th century. Medieval Hungarian chronicles had already begun this appropriation, claiming direct descent from Attila's people despite the chronological impossibility. The Gesta Hungarorum, written around 1200, constructed elaborate genealogies connecting Hungarian ruling families to Hun leadership. These fabrications gained acceptance because they provided the prestige of ancient origins and justified Hungarian control over territories that other peoples also claimed. By the time serious historical scholarship emerged, these legendary connections had become so embedded in Hungarian self-understanding that challenging them provoked nationalist outrage. The German appropriation of Attila followed different patterns, incorporating him into the Nibelungenlied and other medieval epics as a powerful but honourable ruler who hosted Germanic heroes at his court. This literary tradition transformed him from enemy into respected ally, a shift that reflected German attempts to claim all significant figures from the migration period as part of their own heritage. The Nibelungen tradition portrayed Attila, called Etzel in German versions, as a wise king who offered refuge to Germanic warriors and maintained order over vast territories. This positive portrayal contradicted Roman and Christian sources, but suited German cultural needs. These national appropriations reveal how malleable historical figures become when primary sources remain sparse and ambiguous. With limited contemporary documentation and no Hun written records, interpreters enjoyed wide latitude in constructing versions of Attila that served their purposes. Each culture selected different aspects to emphasize, creating multiple Attilas who shared little beyond the name. The process continues today as modern nations seek historical legitimation through connections to powerful ancient figures. Archaeological evidence provides some corrective to these legendary elaborations, though it too requires careful interpretation. Material culture from Hun-controlled territories shows the diversity of peoples under their authority and the ways steppe traditions mixed with sedentary practices. Burial sites reveal both pure nomadic traditions and hybrid customs that combined steppe and Germanic elements. The famous treasure of Nagezent Miklos, while dating from after the Hun period, demonstrates the continuity of steppe artistic styles in the region and the lasting influence of nomadic aesthetics on later populations. Weapons and horse equipment from Hun period sites confirm the military focus of their society and the sophistication of their cavalry technology. Composite bows, specialized arrowheads, and elaborate horse harnesses show the investment required to maintain effective steppe warfare capabilities. These material remains support textual descriptions of Hun military prowess while also revealing the economic systems necessary to sustain specialized warrior elites. Someone had to produce the food, craft the weapons, and maintain the horses that made Hun armies formidable. The sudden disappearance of distinctively Hun material culture after Attila's death suggest rapid assimilation rather than complete population departure. People didn't vanish. They simply adopted different cultural markers as Hun political identity lost its advantages. Within a generation, archaeological sites in formerly Hun-controlled territories show predominantly Germanic material culture with only occasional steppe elements. This transformation indicates how political identities in this period remained fluid, shifting as power structures changed. Modern genetic studies add another dimension to understanding Hun origins and legacy, though the results complicate rather than clarify traditional narratives. DNA evidence from burial sites associated with Huns shows extremely diverse ancestry, confirming the multi-ethnic character of their confederation. Some individuals show East Asian genetic markers consistent with Central Asian origins, but many others display predominantly European ancestry. This genetic diversity matches historical accounts describing Huns as incorporating various peoples, but it makes claims about Hun racial or ethnic identity problematic. The genetic data also reveals limited biological continuity between Hun period populations and later inhabitants of the same regions. Most modern populations in areas the Huns controlled show little genetic contribution from people buried in Hun period graves. This finding suggests that Hun leadership and military elites may have differed genetically from subject populations, and that these elites either departed, died without descendants, or were absorbed into larger populations without leaving detectable genetic traces. The biological evidence thus supports the historical pattern of rapid political collapse, followed by cultural assimilation. These scientific approaches illuminate aspects of Hun history that texts cannot address, but they also generate new questions. If genetic evidence shows diverse origins, what constituted Hun identity? If material culture changed rapidly, what continuities persisted? The answers require integrating multiple forms of evidence while acknowledging that significant gaps will remain. No amount of archaeology or genetics can fully compensate for the absence of Hun-written sources that might explain how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The impact of Attila's empire on subsequent European development extended beyond immediate military and political effects to influence fundamental structures of medieval society. The collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West, accelerated by Hun invasions, created conditions for the feudal systems that would characterize medieval Europe. Local strongmen providing protection against external threats became more important than distant imperial administrators who could no longer guarantee security. This shift from public to private power structures owed much to the chaos Hun invasions helped create. Religious developments also reflected Hun influence, though indirectly. The Church's survival and eventual dominance during the migration period owed partly to its ability to provide continuity and organization when secular structures collapsed. Bishops became civic leaders not because they sought political power, but because they were the only figures with authority that transcended tribal and ethnic divisions. The Hun threat, by demonstrating the vulnerability of Roman military power, elevated the Church as an alternative source of stability and identity. The military lessons from Hun warfare influenced European martial culture for centuries. The effectiveness of mounted archery and mobile warfare tactics impressed observers even as they struggled to counter them. Medieval European armies gradually incorporated more cavalry and developed their own mobile forces, though they never matched steppe peoples in mounted archery skills. The armoured knight, the characteristic warrior of medieval Europe, represented a response to threats like the Huns, a heavy cavalry force that could withstand arrow fire and deliver devastating shock charges. Economic systems also felt lasting effects. The disruption of long-distance trade routes during Hun invasions contributed to the localization of European economies that characterized the early medieval period. When Mediterranean trade networks collapsed under barbarian pressure, regions became more self-sufficient and isolated. This economic fragmentation reinforced political decentralization and helped create the patchwork of small kingdoms and principalities that covered Europe after Rome's fall. The Huns didn't cause these changes alone, but their invasions accelerated processes already underway. The question of what might have happened had Attila lived longer or succeeded in conquering more Roman territory invites speculation that historians usually avoid. Yet the counterfactual is worth considering because it illuminates how contingent his achievements were. Had he lived another decade, could he have established a lasting steppe empire in Europe? The evidence suggests not, because the fundamental problems with Hun confederation structure would have persisted regardless of his personal abilities. Steppe empires typically collapsed after 1 or 2 generations because they lacked the administrative infrastructure to govern sedentary populations effectively. The Huns excelled at military pressure and extraction of tribute, but showed little capacity for direct administration of agricultural territories. Even if Attila had conquered Rome itself, governing the territory would have required transforming Hun society in ways that would have eliminated its military advantages. The choice was stark: remain mobile and militarily effective, but unable to directly control territory, or settle down and lose the mobility that made conquest possible. This dilemma faced all steppe empires that expanded into agricultural regions. Some, like the Mongols, temporarily solved it through brutal efficiency and willingness to destroy productive capacity rather than govern it. Others, like the Khazars, created hybrid systems that separated military and administrative functions. But none achieved permanent solutions because the social organizations required for steppe warfare and territorial administration remained fundamentally incompatible. Attila's Hun confederation faced this same impossible choice, and likely would have fragmented regardless of how long he lived. The Roman Empire's survival in the east, while collapsing in the west, also owed something to geography and Hun strategic choices. Constantinople's position protected it from easy steppe attack, requiring naval capabilities the Huns lacked. When Attila focused westward, he allowed the Eastern Empire to recover and reorganize. Had he concentrated his forces against Constantinople instead, the outcome might have differed, though capturing the city would have required siege capabilities the Huns never developed. The Eastern Empire's survival ensured that Roman civilization continued in Byzantine form, preserving classical knowledge and traditions that would eventually flow back to Western Europe. The transmission of this knowledge depended on networks that Hun invasions both disrupted and inadvertently preserved. As Western Roman schools closed and libraries disappeared, monks fleeing barbarian invasions carried texts eastward to Constantinople or into remote monasteries where they survived. The Church's role as preserver of learning increased precisely because secular institutions collapsed. In this ironic way, the destruction caused by peoples like the Huns helped ensure that classical texts survived for later rediscovery during the Renaissance. Cultural mixing during the migration period also produced unexpected benefits, despite the violence and disruption. Germanic peoples who had encountered steppe cultures brought new artistic styles, military techniques, and social practices into former Roman territories. The synthesis of Roman, Germanic, and steppe elements created medieval European culture, which differed from all 3 parent traditions. This creative mixing wouldn't have occurred without the forced population movements and cultural encounters that Hun invasions triggered. The linguistic evidence for this mixing appears in loanwords and place names that reflect the diverse peoples interacting during this period. Latin absorbed Germanic and occasionally steppe terms, while Germanic languages incorporated Latin vocabulary as tribes settled in former Roman territories. The resulting linguistic diversity contributed to the development of distinct Romance and Germanic language families that still characterize European linguistic geography. Even the absence of Hun linguistic traces tells a story about rapid assimilation and the disappearance of Hun ethnic identity. Modern popular culture's engagement with Attila reveals continuing fascination with barbarian conquest and civilization's fragility. Films, novels, and games set during the Hun invasions typically emphasize violence and cultural clash, while often romanticizing steppe life as more authentic than decadent Roman civilization. These portrayals say more about contemporary anxieties regarding civilization and barbarism than about 5th century realities, but they ensure that Attila remains recognizable to audiences who know nothing else about late antiquity. The barbarian label itself deserves examination because it shapes how we understand this period. Romans used the term for anyone outside their cultural sphere, making it more about cultural identity than developmental stage. Many so-called barbarians possess sophisticated social organizations and rich cultural traditions that Roman sources ignored or dismissed. The Huns particularly suffered from this Roman prejudice because their nomadic lifestyle seemed incomprehensible to settled Mediterranean peoples who valued permanent cities and written culture above all else. Recognizing this bias requires reading sources against their grain, looking for what Roman authors reveal despite their intentions. When Priscus describes Hun camps as disorganized and primitive, his details actually show complex social hierarchies and effective resource management. When Jordanes portrays Huns as barely human, his account still preserves information about their political structures and military capabilities. Critical reading recovers historical reality from hostile sources, though it can never completely overcome their limitations. The absence of Hun voices in surviving sources represents the greatest obstacle to understanding their perspective. We know how Romans and Germanic peoples viewed Huns, but not how Huns understood themselves or their relationships with others. Did they see themselves as conquerors bringing order to chaos, or simply as peoples seeking better pastures and economic opportunities? Did they view Romans as effete and weak, or as possessors of desirable goods and technologies? These questions remain unanswerable because the Huns left no written records and no oral traditions that survived their rapid assimilation. This silence reminds us how much of history reflects the perspectives of literate elites who had both means and motivation to record their views. Countless peoples and movements left no trace because they lacked writing systems or because their records didn't survive. The Huns exist in history only through their enemies' accounts, a situation that guarantees distortion but doesn't make historical reconstruction impossible. By comparing sources, using archaeological evidence, and applying critical methods, historians can approach something like truth despite the limitations. The methodological challenges historians face when studying the Huns illuminate broader questions about how we reconstruct ancient peoples who left minimal direct evidence. Archaeological sites attributed to Huns often resist clear identification because nomadic groups leave fewer permanent traces than settled populations. A temporary camp occupied for one season produces far less material evidence than a permanent settlement inhabited for generations. The artifacts that do survive, weapons and horse gear primarily, could belong to various steppe peoples rather than specifically to Huns, making confident attribution difficult without supporting textual evidence linking objects to known Hun territories. Burial practices offer somewhat better evidence because funerary customs tend to be culturally specific and produce concentrated artifact deposits. Graves from the Hun period in the Carpathian Basin show distinctive features, including artificial cranial deformation, a practice that involved binding infants' heads to create elongated skulls considered beautiful in some steppe cultures. These modified skulls appear suddenly in the archaeological record of Eastern Europe during the late 4th century, coinciding with Hun arrivals documented in texts. However, cranial modification alone doesn't prove Hun ethnicity because other steppe groups practiced it as well, and the custom could spread through cultural contact rather than population movement. The distribution of certain artifact types, particularly cauldrons and distinctive bronze fittings, has been mapped across Eastern Europe to trace Hun presence. These objects appear in a belt stretching from the Pontic steppe through the Carpathian Basin into Central Europe, matching the geographical extent of Hun power described in written sources. Yet interpreting this distribution requires caution because objects circulate through trade and gift exchange, not just population movement. A Hun-style cauldron found in a Germanic grave might indicate Hun presence, trade contact, or cultural influence without actual Hun settlers. Genetic studies of skeletal remains from this period offer new possibilities for tracking population movements, though with significant limitations. Ancient DNA analysis can identify individuals with Central Asian ancestry appearing in Europe during the migration period, but connecting genetic signatures to specific historical groups like the Huns remains problematic. Genetic ancestry reflects biological descent rather than cultural identity, and individuals of diverse genetic backgrounds could identify as Huns if they adopted Hun language and customs. The political and cultural entity, called Huns, in historical sources, probably encompassed people of various genetic ancestries, united by shared leadership and lifestyle. The question of what happened to the Huns after their confederation collapsed has generated considerable speculation, but limited consensus. Some populations probably returned to the Pontic steppe, reverting to the pastoral nomadic lifestyle their ancestors had practiced before the Western migrations. Others settled permanently in the Carpathian Basin and surrounding regions, gradually adopting the languages and customs of neighboring peoples. The speed of this assimilation suggests that Hun ethnic identity was relatively flexible, defined more by political allegiance to specific leaders than by deep cultural traditions that resisted change. The Bulgars who established kingdoms in the Balkans during the 7th century may have included descendants of Hun groups, though the connection remains controversial. Medieval sources sometimes conflated Bulgars with Huns, but whether this reflected actual continuity or simply Roman confusion of different steppe peoples is unclear. Linguistic evidence doesn't clarify matters because we know too little about the Hun language to compare it reliably with Bulgar. The possibility exists that some Hun groups maintained distinct identities for generations after Attila's death, but they left no clear trace in the historical record. The Avars, who dominated the Carpathian Basin from the late 6th through early 9th centuries, have also been connected to Hun heritage, with some scholars proposing that Avar ruling elites descended from Hun confederates who had remained in the region. Archaeological similarities between Hun and Avar material culture support this theory, as do certain continuities in military techniques and political organization. However, the 2-century gap between Hun collapse and Avar arrival complicates direct connection arguments. The Avars might have consciously imitated Hun practices they knew from oral traditions, rather than representing biological or cultural descendants. Chinese sources from the 6th century mention groups called Huns, or Hephthalites in Central Asia, leading to theories about Eastern Hun migrations following their European defeats. These White Huns, as Byzantine sources, called them established powerful kingdoms in Bactria, and threatened Sasanian Persia before Turkic peoples destroyed their power in the mid-6th century. Whether they had any connection to Attila's Huns, or simply shared a name, remains debated. The distances involved and the chronological gaps make direct connections unlikely, though both groups shared steppe nomadic origins and similar military cultures. The legacy of Hun invasions for European political development extends beyond immediate military impacts to influence long-term institutional evolution. The defensive measures Roman provinces adopted to resist Hun raids, including fortified settlements and local military organizations, created precedents for medieval feudal structures. When central Roman authority collapsed, these local defense systems provided foundations for the regionalized power structures that characterized early medieval Europe. The necessity of organizing rapid military responses to nomadic threats had pushed Roman frontier regions toward greater local autonomy decades before formal imperial collapse. The economic disruptions caused by Hun invasions accelerated the transition from ancient to medieval economic systems in several ways. Long-distance trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world with northern Europe suffered severe damage during the migration period, forcing greater regional self-sufficiency. The breakdown of Roman monetary systems in many areas reflected both decreased trade and the loss of state capacity to maintain currency standards. These changes pushed European economy toward the more localized, agriculture-based systems that would characterize the early Middle Ages, though the process was gradual rather than sudden. Urban decline in many parts of Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries resulted partly from the instability Hun invasions helped create. Cities that depended on long-distance trade and imperial administration struggled when these systems failed. Populations often relocated to more defensible positions or dispersed into rural areas where agricultural production could continue despite political chaos. This de-urbanization wasn't universal. Italy and parts of Gaul maintained significant urban centers, but the overall trend towards smaller, more dispersed settlements reshaped European social geography. The military innovations that became widespread during the Hun period influenced medieval European warfare for centuries. Heavy cavalry tactics, the composite bow, and the emphasis on mobility that Huns exemplified all affected how successor kingdoms organized their armies. Germanic rulers who had fought alongside or against Huns adopted many of their military practices, creating hybrid forces that combined Roman discipline with steppe mobility. The stirrup, whose spread through Europe coincided with the Hun period, though its origins remain disputed, enabled more effective cavalry combat and contributed to the development of medieval mounted warfare. The psychological impact of Hun invasions on Roman and post-Roman societies appears in the anxieties about barbarian threats that permeate 5th century literature and legislation. The fear that civilization might be overwhelmed by savage outsiders became a recurring theme in Christian writings from this period, with authors like Salvian using barbarian invasions as evidence of divine judgment against Roman sins. These apocalyptic interpretations shaped how medieval Europeans understood their relationship to the classical past and their vulnerability to external threats. The historical memory of Attila evolved dramatically during the medieval period as different peoples claimed or rejected connection to Hun heritage. Germanic epic traditions preserved in works like the Nibelungenlied transformed Attila into a Germanic king hosting heroes at his court, completely reversing the historical relationship where Germanic people served Hun rulers. This transformation shows how oral traditions reshape history to serve contemporary identity needs, incorporating powerful historical figures into cultural narratives regardless of historical accuracy. The Attila of Germanic epic bears little resemblance to the historical Hun ruler, but the legendary figure served important cultural functions in medieval society. Hungarian national traditions claiming descent from Attila's Huns emerged during the medieval period and persisted into modern times despite limited historical foundation. The Magyars, who established the Hungarian kingdom in the late 9th century, came from the Ural region and had no direct connection to Attila's confederation. However, the prestige associated with Hun heritage and the geographical coincidence of both groups ruling the Carpathian Basin encouraged this identification. Medieval Hungarian chronicles invented genealogies connecting their rulers to Attila, creating a glorious pagan past that legitimized Hungarian claims to their territory. The persistence of these origin myths, despite historical evidence against them, demonstrates the power of national narratives to shape collective identity. Modern Hungarians generally recognize the distinction between Huns and Magyars at an intellectual level, but Attila remains a symbol of Hungarian national greatness, his image appearing on monuments and in popular culture. This shows how historical figures can transcend their actual historical contexts to become symbols serving contemporary needs. Their legendary personas often more culturally significant than their historical realities. The role of the Huns in accelerating the transformation of the Roman world from a unified Mediterranean empire to a collection of regional kingdoms represents their most significant historical impact. This process would probably have occurred eventually, even without Hun invasions. Internal Roman problems made the empire's division likely. However, the Huns dramatically accelerated the timeline and influenced how division occurred. Their military pressure forced decisions and migrations that might otherwise have taken generations, compressing historical change into a few critical decades. The question of whether to view the migration period as catastrophic collapse or creative transformation depends partly on perspective and geography. For inhabitants of cities that were sacked or provinces that suffered devastating raids, the period represented genuine catastrophe with populations killed or displaced and cultural achievements destroyed. For Germanic groups that established new kingdoms on Roman territory, the same period offered unprecedented opportunities for political advancement and cultural synthesis. The Huns served as catalysts for both destruction and creation, their invasions simultaneously devastating existing structures and opening spaces for new political formations. The environmental factors that may have contributed to Hun migrations and their impacts deserve consideration alongside political and military explanations. Climate variations during the 4th and 5th centuries affected steppe ecology and agricultural productivity in ways that could have pushed nomadic groups westward, while also weakening Roman frontier defences. Cold periods reduced pasture quality on the steppe, encouraging migrations toward more favourable territories. Simultaneously, environmental stress in Roman provinces made populations more vulnerable to military threats and less able to maintain defensive infrastructure. The interconnection between climate, disease, and political instability during this period created cascading effects that amplified the impact of Hun invasions. Plague outbreaks in the 6th century, though post-dating Attila, reflected disease ecology changes that migration and warfare had encouraged. Large-scale population movements spread pathogens to new areas, while warfare and displacement created conditions favouring epidemic disease. The cumulative effect of these interlocking factors made recovery from initial shocks more difficult, prolonging the period of instability. Modern scholarship's understanding of the Huns continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries provide evidence and methodological advances enable more sophisticated analysis. Recent excavations in Hungary and Romania have revealed burial sites and settlements that clarify Hun material culture and social organization. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains traces individual migration patterns, showing that some people buried with Hun-style artifacts had spent their childhoods far from where they died, confirming the high mobility that historical sources describe. The interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, historians, geneticists, and climate scientists produces richer understanding than any single discipline could achieve. Each approach has limitations. Texts reflect elite biases. Artifacts require interpretation. Genetic data doesn't map directly to cultural identity, but together, they create convergent evidence supporting certain conclusions while revealing the complexity that resists simple narratives. The Huns emerge from this scholarship as neither the superhuman destroyers of civilization nor the misunderstood victims of Roman propaganda, but as historical actors operating within specific political and environmental contexts that shaped their choices and impacts. The enduring fascination with Attila and the Huns reflects deeper questions about how civilizations respond to external challenges and internal weaknesses. Every generation finds new relevance in this ancient story because the themes it raises remain perpetually contemporary. How do established societies adapt to rapid change? What happens when military power isn't matched by institutional stability? Can diverse peoples unite under charismatic leadership? And what occurs when that leadership disappears? These questions transcend their 5th century context to address fundamental aspects of political organization and social change. The Huns ultimately matter not because they destroyed Rome, they didn't, but because their invasions accelerated transformations that reshaped Europe. The medieval world that emerged from the migration period differed fundamentally from the classical Mediterranean civilization that preceded it. New languages, religions, political structures, and cultural forms replaced or transformed ancient patterns. The Huns didn't cause all these changes, but their explosive impact on 5th century Europe helped determine when and how transformation occurred, making them essential actors in one of history's great transitions. The historical Attila, who died in 453, left behind a confederation that disintegrated within months, his sons fighting over scraps while subject peoples reclaimed their independence. Yet the legendary Attila, who emerged in the centuries that followed, proved far more durable than any empire he could have built. This transformation from historical figure to cultural symbol reveals something fundamental about how societies process traumatic encounters and construct meaning from chaos. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after the events, had access to limited sources and considerable incentive to shape narratives serving contemporary purposes. Christian authors portrayed Attila as divine punishment for Roman sins, incorporating him into theological frameworks that explained suffering through moral failure. Germanic epic traditions transformed him into a respected king, hosting heroes at his court, reversing actual power relationships to create stories that served their own cultural needs. Hungarian national mythology claimed him as a founding ancestor, despite the chronological impossibility, seeking prestige through connection to a formidable historical figure. Each interpretation selected different aspects to emphasize while ignoring inconvenient details. The process continues today as modern media creates new versions of Attila for audiences who consume his story through films, novels, and documentaries that prioritize entertainment over historical accuracy. The barbarian destroyer, the misunderstood leader, the tragic figure doomed by civilization's corruption, all these versions coexist in popular consciousness, each serving different narrative purposes while claiming historical legitimacy. Yet beneath these layers of interpretation, certain historical realities remain clear. A confederation of steppe peoples under capable leadership could challenge even the most powerful empires of the ancient world. Roman military superiority, long assumed to be unquestionable, proved vulnerable to enemies who understood its limitations and exploited them systematically. The tribute payments that Rome made to avoid destruction represented a fundamental shift in power relationships, acknowledging that defending territory cost more than paying protection money to those who threatened it. The speed with which Hun power collapsed after Attila's death demonstrated the fragility of political structures built on personal authority rather than institutional foundations. Without bureaucracies, written laws, or permanent capitals, the Confederation depended entirely on continuous military success and charismatic leadership. Remove those elements, and the entire structure dissolved as component peoples pursued their own interests. This pattern would repeat across steppe history as successive confederations rose and fell, based on individual leaders' abilities to maintain the delicate balance between rewarding followers and extracting resources from victims. The transformation of Europe during and after the Hun invasions created the medieval world that would eventually produce modern Western civilization. This wasn't a simple story of decline from Roman order to barbarian chaos. The migration period represented creative destruction, simultaneously devastating existing structures and creating spaces for new political formations. Germanic kingdoms that emerged from the empire's ruins incorporated elements from Roman, Germanic, and steppe traditions, producing hybrid cultures that differed fundamentally from their source materials. The Church's survival and eventual dominance during this chaotic period owed much to its ability to provide continuity when secular institutions collapsed. Bishops became civic leaders not through political ambition, but because they offered stability that transcended tribal and ethnic divisions. The institutional church preserved not just Christian doctrine, but also classical learning, administrative techniques, and diplomatic practices that would later enable medieval European civilization to develop its distinctive character. Modern genetic studies confirm what historical sources suggested. The peoples called Huns in ancient texts included individuals of diverse biological ancestry, united by political allegiance and shared lifestyle rather than common ethnic origin. This finding complicates nationalist narratives that claim Attila for particular modern populations, while supporting historical accounts describing the Confederation as incorporating various subject peoples. The rapid disappearance of distinctively Hun genetic signatures in later populations indicates that Hun identity dissolved through assimilation rather than departure or extinction. Archaeological evidence reveals both the material culture of Hun period peoples and the limitations of that evidence for answering questions historians most want to ask. Burial goods and settlement patterns document military focus and nomadic lifestyle, but they can't explain how Huns understood their own identity or what they believed about their place in the world. The composite bows, bronze cauldrons, and artificially deformed skulls that appear in graves provide information about practices and technologies, but not about the meanings those objects held for people who used them. The absence of Hun written sources represents the most significant obstacle to fuller understanding. We know how Romans perceived Huns, how Germanic peoples remembered them, how later societies claimed or rejected connection to them. But we don't know how Huns described themselves, what stories they told about their origins, or how they explained their relationship to the peoples they conquered and the empires they threatened. This silence isn't unusual. Most ancient peoples left no written records, their voices lost to history, except as filtered through literate neighbours who had their own reasons for distorting what they observed. The methodological challenges historians face when reconstructing Hun history illuminate broader questions about how we understand any ancient people who left minimal direct evidence. Multiple types of evidence must be integrated: texts that reflect elite biases, archaeological remains that require interpretation, genetic data that doesn't map directly to cultural identity, environmental information that reveals constraints on human action. No single source provides complete answers, but together they create convergent understanding that approaches historical reality despite the limitations. The impact of Attila's campaigns extended far beyond immediate military and political effects to shape fundamental structures of medieval European society. The defensive measures adopted to resist Hun raids created precedents for feudal organization. The economic disruptions accelerated the transition from ancient to medieval economic systems. The psychological trauma of facing an enemy who violated all assumptions about civilized warfare influenced how Europeans understood their vulnerability to external threats for centuries. These indirect effects ultimately mattered more than the battles and sieges that dominate dramatic retellings. The question of what might have happened had Attila lived longer invites speculation about alternative histories, where Hun power endured and reshaped Europe differently. Yet the structural problems that caused rapid collapse after his death would have persisted regardless of his lifespan. Steppe confederations built on military success and personal authority couldn't transition to territorial administration without transforming themselves so completely that they lost the very characteristics that made them formidable. The choice between maintaining nomadic military effectiveness and governing agricultural territories was probably impossible to resolve, making long-term Hun dominance unlikely, even under continued capable leadership. The Roman Empire's survival in the east while collapsing in the west owed much to geography and Attila's strategic choices. Constantinople's position and defences made it far more difficult to threaten than Western cities. The Eastern Empire's greater wealth and more functional bureaucracy enabled it to sustain tribute payments and military resistance simultaneously. When Attila focused westward, he allowed the East to recover and reorganize, ensuring that Roman civilization continued in Byzantine form, even as the West fragmented into Germanic kingdoms. The preservation of classical knowledge through the chaos of the migration period depended on networks that Hun invasions both disrupted and inadvertently strengthened. As Western libraries disappeared and schools closed, texts migrated eastward to Constantinople or into remote monasteries where they survived. The Church's role as cultural preserver increased precisely because secular institutions collapsed. Monks copying manuscripts in isolated scriptoriums maintained intellectual traditions, that would later enable the Carolingian Renaissance and eventually the fuller recovery of classical learning during the Renaissance proper. Modern popular culture's engagement with Attila reveals continuing fascination with questions about civilization's fragility and barbarism's appeal. Films and novels set during the Hun invasions typically emphasize violence while romanticizing nomadic life as more authentic than decadent settled civilization. These portrayals reflect contemporary anxieties about technological society and yearning for simpler existence, using 5th century history as a screen onto which modern concerns are projected. The historical Attila becomes secondary to the symbolic figure who represents whatever contemporary audiences need him to represent. The enduring presence of Attila in Western consciousness, despite limited historical evidence for his actual life and character, demonstrates how certain figures transcend their historical contexts to become archetypal. The charismatic barbarian leader who nearly destroys civilization serves narrative functions that ensure his story's retelling across generations, regardless of historical accuracy. Each era creates its own Attila, adapted to contemporary storytelling conventions and cultural needs, ensuring that the legendary figure evolves while the historical person remains frustratingly obscure. The distinction between these versions matters for understanding both what actually happened in the 5th century and why people continue to care about events so distant in time. The historical Huns represented one phase in the long interaction between steppe nomads and agricultural empires, a particularly dramatic episode in patterns that extended across millennia. Their invasions accelerated transformations already underway in Roman society while demonstrating vulnerabilities that subsequent enemies would exploit. The legendary Attila serves different purposes, embodying fears about external threats and fantasies about simpler, more violent times when individual prowess determined outcomes rather than complex institutions and technologies. Both versions have value. Historical understanding requires careful analysis of limited evidence to reconstruct what probably happened and why it mattered. Cultural analysis requires examining how societies remember and reinterpret the past to serve present needs. The Huns and Attila offer material for both approaches. Their historical impact significant enough to merit serious study, while their legendary status rich enough to reveal much about how collective memory operates across centuries. The ultimate significance of Attila and the Huns lies in their role as catalysts during one of history's great transitions. They didn't destroy the Roman Empire, which collapsed from internal problems as much as external pressure. They didn't create medieval Europe, which emerged from complex interactions among multiple peoples over several centuries. But they accelerated processes already underway and influenced how those processes unfolded. Their explosive impact on 5th century Europe compressed historical change that might have taken generations into a few critical decades, making them essential actors in the transformation from ancient to medieval world. The confederation Attila built was always temporary, held together by personal authority and continuous military success rather than institutional foundations that could outlast individual leaders. Its collapse was inevitable once those conditions changed. Yet the brief period when Huns dominated Eastern Europe left permanent traces in the geography of power, the distribution of peoples, and the collective memory of societies that survived the chaos. These traces remain visible today in the political boundaries, ethnic compositions, and cultural anxieties that characterize modern Europe, testaments to events that occurred over 15 centuries ago. Understanding the Huns requires moving beyond both uncritical acceptance of hostile sources and romantic rehabilitation that ignores the violence they inflicted. They were neither demonic destroyers nor noble savages, but historical actors responding to opportunities and constraints within specific contexts. Their military effectiveness reflected sophisticated adaptation to steppe environments and ruthless exploitation of Roman weaknesses. Their rapid collapse demonstrated the limitations of political structures that depended on personal authority rather than institutional continuity. Their lasting impact came not from what they built, but from what their invasions destroyed and the spaces that destruction created for new formations. The story of Attila and the Huns thus offers no simple lessons about civilization and barbarism, progress and decline, order and chaos. Instead, it reveals the complexity of historical change and the multiple factors that shape outcomes during periods of transformation. Military power matters, but so do institutional capacity, environmental conditions, disease ecology, and countless individual decisions whose consequences compound unpredictably. The Huns succeeded for a time because circumstances favoured their particular combination of capabilities. They failed ultimately because those same capabilities couldn't adapt to the requirements of sustained territorial control. For contemporary audiences, the Hun invasions provide perspective on our own era's upheavals and anxieties. Civilizations that appear permanent and powerful can fragment rapidly when underlying conditions shift. Established institutions can prove vulnerable to challenges from unexpected directions. The distinction between civilization and barbarism, so clear in theory, becomes ambiguous when examined closely. These insights remain relevant regardless of how much separates our world from 5th century Europe. The historical Attila died in 453, probably from natural causes, despite the dramatic circumstances ancient sources describe. His confederation disintegrated almost immediately, his people dispersing and assimilating so thoroughly that they left almost no trace in the genetic or cultural makeup of modern populations. Within a century, the Huns had become legendary figures rather than contemporary threats, their historical reality already obscured by layers of interpretation and myth. That rapid transformation from historical actor to cultural symbol continues today, ensuring that Attila remains present in Western consciousness even as his actual life and achievements recede further into scholarly debate and uncertainty.